He's working for the Greens at the European Parliament, and he will lecture in English. So if you have any problem with that, just raise your hand or give a sign that he should speak slowly or something. Okay? Thank you.
And be aware that there is no alternative. So
you can speak French.
Yes, there is an alternative, but it might not be the most suitable for you. All right. Excellent. Alors, je vais tout faire en français. No, that's right. I mean, if you at some point feel like a drowning man or woman in the sea, you just raise your hand and you ask the question before it's too late, okay? And that's part of the thing. I'll try to be as explicit as possible. I'm going to start with a few words of presentation and a disclaimer. The disclaimer is I work for the Green Group, the Green Group of the European Parliament, the GGEP, but I'm presenting not a line of the group. I'm not presenting anything that is official. Even when I'm presenting something that is official, the line, this is also an interpretation. This is something that is quite personal. As a political scientist, as an historian, and as a strategic advisor for the group for the past 7 years. So that's basically it. It doesn't mean that this is not a Leninist thing, okay? So there's not one party line and you need to follow it. It's actually much more creative than that. That's the first thing. Just to make sure that you understand also the distinctions, this is not the Green European Party. The European Green Party is the party, the 44 actually members at European level, including outside of the EU. This is the Green Group. The Green Group is only 15 nationals from the European Union, and this is mostly a northwestern Green Group, which is not entirely, not exclusively, because you have 2 Hungarian members and you have a few other members from Central Europe and a few members from the south, but the bulk is composed of German, French, Dutch, Belgians, Scandinavians and British members. So that really is also a kind of important difference in the perspective that you can have. The other thing, the other hat that I wear very keenly is my hat of a member of the editorial board of the Green European Journal. The Green European Journal is one of the projects of the GEF. This is actually one of the lead projects. This is something that is independent from the GEF in the party and the group, but that is embedded, of course, in European green politics. The journal is a 2 or 3 times a year. I strongly encourage you to get acquainted with the website, greeneuropeanjournal.eu, and the paper editions, because we try to cover, as well, of course we're not covering the news, but we try to cover things that are deep into the debate. And the very last edition, for instance, was on security, and the next one will be on cities, and how cities are the laboratory of the new kind of politics. We had one on fears and tremblings in Europe. We try to stick to the prospective reflection and also to the, let's say, the European debate within the Greens and outside of the Greens, of course, because otherwise this is very endogamic and this is not exactly what we want. This is to be said. As far as I'm concerned, I used to be an active party member in the French Greens. I no longer am, but it doesn't mean that I'm no longer Green. That's quite important also. And you will find also probably because there is a very loose policy of being a member or not a member when it comes to training, which I find extremely good because this is very open. It doesn't need to be a party membership connected. And this is very important because party politics is one way to do politics. There are many, many other ways to do politics. And all of them are important. This is it. This is the disclaimer. Now, I would like to get started with something that is quite personal, but to make you understand something about the context. When I graduated from my let's call it college university, because the grandes écoles in French is a very specific system, but when I graduated from Sciences Po, which is a very high standard, elite, prestige, whatever you name it, French school in '95, which gives you a hint, it's 95, okay? For you it's probably prehistoric, but it's not exactly the beginnings of the European Union, right? And yet, in this big French elite school, for 3 years, I hadn't heard more than twice the word European Union. I hadn't been taught about the European Union. I didn't get any training on the European Union. Erasmus existed at that time. The program was about 4 or 5 years old already, but no one did it, or very little. There was a Franco-German cycle, but you had to be already bilingual to get into it, so it was not exactly the kind of stuff that you learn into. Europe, for the French, was extremely remote. And we're talking about 95. Things have changed a lot. And you live in a context where the European construction is no longer a raison d'etat. So no longer something that is pursued because it's good. But it's no longer also something quite remote that is happening in Brussels or Frankfurt or the capital or wherever. This is something that has become a very pragmatic and tangible issue in our daily lives, which is both a very good thing and politically a big problem. It's politically a big problem because it was never really ready to do that. It intended to be that. It intended to be a political project, but it never really had the system to actually fulfill this. But it's a very good thing, because if we want to move forward, this is where we need to be. To give you one little more example, over the past 6 decades, the members of the European Union, first 6, then 9, well, then 9, then 10, then 12, 15, 27, Big Bang, 28, and soon 27 again. What happened? They started to pull things, to pull policies and elements, and we'll see why. But we've come to a point where we're getting into the hard flesh of the state now. The currency, the democratic system, the sovereignty, defense, counterintelligence. Terrorism is a big question that is talking about European FBI, European CIA. I'm using the only federation that we have all in reference. Of course, I could use the BND from Germany, but I don't think this is exactly relevant. But so there's talks about that. We're getting into the very flesh of what has been so far our national environment, our political environment, the nation state. And this is why it's becoming so important and also so difficult and crisis-ridden. It's no longer something that you can leave to either technocrats or populists. This is something that is our business at all. And this is where we get started. So far, so good? I'm not talking too far, too fast, too remote. Good, excellent. We're going to start with this. These are the 3 things that I want you to reflect with me on. We're going to get started with a big question, which is, who is Brussels? Because that's something I really like. Well, let's be ungreen and waste paper. I write like a pig, I know, I'm a teacher. Who is Brussels? You hear in the media, whatever the media is, be it the TV, the press, you read, you hear in the conversation, Brussels has decided. Brussels is the new Moscow. By the way, Roman, you know the first one who said that? It was Václav Klaus, the infamous president of the Czech Republic. Very, very Eurosceptic, strange ties with the East. Less than the current one, but quite interesting too. Anyway, he said that to Romano Prodi, who was the president of the European Commission at that time. I think it was in 2002 or 2003. And Romano Prodi looked at him and said, "Yes, of course. Can you remind me the date of your application to the USSR?" So, Brussels. What is Brussels? Any guess?
In Hungary, Brussels is an empire.
Exactly. Well, we'll come to that. It is an empire. But what kind of empire? That's the thing.
The power of an empire.
The power of an empire. Let's get started with this. What are the weapons of the empire? How many empires do you know? Like
Russian Empire.
a Russian Empire. Oh, that's the best one. Is it the only one you can master?
Sorry.
What's the blueprint of the empire? Rome. Well, they have something in common. There are other empires. I mean, you could have the French Empire, Napoleon. It stretched until here. You had the Third Reich. That was an empire, short-lived, but you know, kind of imprinted the situation quite well here, everywhere. So, what's an empire usually? In our memory, an empire is imposed with tanks, panzers, or T-34, or grognards, you know, the Grande Armée, the French Grande Armée, or the Roman armies. Do you see any here? And yet it's an empire, yes. Because the second thing of the empire is the rule of law. The rule of law is also something. So, you see, you're moving from empire seen as imperialistic, the imposition of something you don't want by force, to something that is actually part of you, and you're part of it because you want it. This is the rule of law. So I'll come back to this. What is Brussels? Brussels is the capital of the empire. Okay, fine. So whenever Brussels decides, who decides? Ah, that's already jumping the gun. That's already jumping the gun. I mean, I know you've been there. You've probably been there at school or even with former. But let's get started. You probably know that there is what is called by scholars and what is barely known, by the way, by journalists and people who are supposed to report on that, an institutional triangle. You know that. You know how it works. You got here at the top of the triangle the European Commission, and what does the Commission do?
Proposals.
Exactly, it proposes stuff. It proposes text, because when it's about a rule of law, you rule by texts, you know, by legal text, by laws. This is the same thing as a government, but it's not a government. A government also, in my country, for instance, the government has the monopoly of the initiative of laws. And we don't deem the government illegitimate for so. So it has the monopoly, and here it has the monopoly of the initiatives, but it's not the only thing, and it cannot do anything without the two other pillars. So here you have the European Commission, which is just producing legislation, guidelines, directives, recommendations, regulations, and sometimes it communicates, because not everything is European competence, but everything has a European side. So the Commission sometimes doesn't have the legal basis to act, but it has the political duty to send a communication or recommendation, which is sometimes difficult to understand. But who is Brussels? At some point you realize that Brussels is the Commission, because Brussels has decided or Brussels has proposed. But it's not enough. I mean, it's just a Commission, and it can be a proposal of the Commission and not a decision from the Commission, because you have the two other elements. The big ones is the European Council here. Because remember, and never forget that, the European Union exists only because the European member states want it. It's not something superimposed that is coming from nowhere, from thin air. This is something that is exactly happening here, and always has. It doesn't mean that everything is in the hands of the government, but it means that there is no decision taken by Brussels that is not at some point taken by Paris, Berlin, Budapest, Warsaw, Stockholm, even London. This is where it's happening. This is a collection also of states. Without the states, there is no union. It's a union of people and states. Okay? And we come to the people, because they're the last ones to get into the picture. We got the EP, the European Parliament, of whom you had an eminent representative this morning, and you have, I think it's 22 Hungarian MEPs?
Yeah.
Yes. So 22 elected in this country. They're not here to represent the Hungarian people, they're here to represent the European citizens, and they were elected by the Hungarian people, which is a complete different perspective, if you see my point. Because when you are an MP, a member of the parliament, or a member of the European Parliament, or a member of the national parliament, it's basically the same. You are representing two logics that are not mutually exclusive, but that are not the same, and that you need to combine. You are directly connected to a territory and people who actually voted for you, which is why you are their representative, their deputy, which is the etymology of the word. But on the other hand, you are also sitting in an assembly that is trying to get the general interest. And the general interest is not just the interest of the people that you represent, it's the general interest of everyone. And when we mean everyone here, it's not 10 million of Hungarians, it's 500 million of European citizens. So this is also the two logics that are at work, and I confess, let's be very direct, not many MPs and not many MEPs understand that. But it's part of politics, and it's the same at national level. So, Brussels can be the European Commission. It's a text that has been proposed, I don't know, on the reduction of diesel emissions. Why not? Brussels is also the European Council. It's been the Council that decided, no, there will be no threshold for diesel emissions, or it will be enhanced to that point, to that level, which is good for the German, the French, and the British industry. Or it will be the European Parliament that votes. And even if the European Parliament that votes, it can be a vote in the committee, and it's still Brussels, huh? It's happening, or Strasbourg sometimes, but here we're talking about Brussels. It can be a vote in a committee, like the employment committee that passed, before it was anything, that passed the revision of the posted works directive. It started here in the committee, and it was reported as Brussels already, but it was a committee, so it was not a commission, it was not a council, it was not even the parliament at that time, it was a committee in the parliament. And then it can become a plenary, which is no longer Brussels, by the way. Where's the plenary sitting in the European Parliament? It's in Strasbourg. So it's still Europe, but it's no longer Brussels, you see? So here we're getting another place. And when the European Council is meeting like it is now, right now, like it was in Gothenburg, it's no longer Brussels, but it's still Europe. So Brussels actually, and you see what I mean, Brussels is the metonymy, this is the pot in which you put actually the power, the empire if you prefer, I like that. This is the embodiment of a power that has daily exertion on national legislation. Now the big fantasy is that how much of the national legislation is coming from Europe?
In Hungary?
No, everywhere.
50%?
Yeah, there's a big fantasy that it's 80%. It's not even 30. It's not even 30 because, well, the competence of the European Union is not encompassing the entire spectrum of politics. Of course, it's growing, and it makes sense because the more you advance in pooling your sovereignty in many things, the more there are elements. But 30% is already a good chunk. That means that 30% of the national legislation on banks, for instance, or on single market, or on your rights as a citizen when you're no longer in your country, because this is the primary justification of the activity of the Commission. Well, it's still coming. It's still a good chunk, but it's not a majority like you hear too often. Education, culture, well, schools, for instance, social protection and safety nets, energy mix. All of this is national. And it's safeguarded as a national prerogative. It's called subsidiarity. I'll come to this. I mean, it's not under the remit necessarily of the European Union and of the center of power that Brussels is. Except that it's dramatized. Brussels is the equivalent of the center of power in the imaginary. We're talking about representations here. So this is why I'm talking, who is Brussels? This is not to give you a lecture on the institutional triangle, because I'm sure that you can learn this in any Wikipedia. It's not the point. I'm just trying to show you that whenever you're talking about the empire, whenever you're talking about the power that is behind that, you need to have a better picture, a more informed picture of what we're talking about. Because it could be Strasbourg because it's the parliament. And in some elements that are co-decision, in co-decision that means that these guys and those guys, so the citizens and the states, have actually worked together on the text, and that the Commission may be happy or unhappy with the result, but they have to swallow it. It doesn't mean that they cannot fight it, of course, and sometimes they will. But it will mean that at some point, the last word will be here, and most of the time the last word is here. Huh? So whenever they tell you Brussels imposed anything on you, ask your capital what they did. And that's the same for journalists also, but for informed citizens. So it could be Strasbourg, it could be, well, this is less of an issue here because you're not part of the euro, but still, at some point, because Hungary, like every other country post-95, is supposed to join with the euro, it could be the Eurogroup. The Eurogroup is not Brussels. Of course it meets in Brussels, but it's not Brussels. This is actually, you know what it is. This is an informal stuff that is not even happening in the treaties, that has no other basis than the political will. It was the informal gathering of the Minister of Finances whose country has the euro as a currency, formally. But of course, with the size, the growing size of the euro and the growing size of the issues that you have to deal with the Eurozone governance, it became increasingly more important in the institutional, not even triangle, but institutional nebula. And you hear a lot of that. But it could be also a decision that is taken somewhere else. In Frankfurt, for instance, ECB. We'll wait for the dead. It could be the ECB. This is quite important because the ECB, well, is not depending on the citizens, not depending on the states, not exactly, not depending on the Commission. It's independent. It's part of the neoliberal Washington consensus that your central bank should be safe. That's the idea. Safe from political interference. This is of course an illusion, because this is already a political decision. But it means also this is not exactly Brussels. Here, most of the time when it's reported, because it's reported by people who actually know the stuff a bit better than the rest, it's kind of safe. I mean, you hear that it's been the ECB and it was taken in Frankfurt or wherever, but still, for a lot of people, the confusion, for a lot of citizens, and it makes sense that it's confused. All of this is Brussels, even when it's not. And then you have people who have understood that. And I'll come to this, because Brussels is a big bubble. Big bubble. Actually, one of the myths that is usually debunked on that, especially when it comes to the European Commission, is the size of the European Commission. It's not the big tentacular, technocratic, bureaucratic stuff. I mean, of course, it's very bureaucratic, trust me, I've been there. But it's not exactly the drawers of the bureaucracy in Soviet style, okay? It's more like a big company. You know, there's not anything more bureaucratic than a big company, a big bank, or IBM, or I don't know Apple, so, but well, at least the ones of the 80s. This is extremely bureaucratic. If any of you is interested in the reference on that, maybe I'll use this one. I strongly recommend you to read David Graeber, and especially The Utopia of Rules, which is a very good book, in which you will find some of the elements that I just mentioned. Great book. Huge. Let's get back to this. This is about 40,000 people. It's still big, but it's smaller than Birmingham. This is smaller than the Ville de Paris. So, yes, it's an administration, and every administration is bureaucratic in essence, and every bureaucracy is just getting on your nerves. It makes sense. But trust me, it draws a lot of fantasies. For the French, this is a neoliberal Trojan horse of the British. For the British, this is the worst of the French administration and bureaucracy. So, who do you believe? Right? It's probably everything that. This is all of this Brussels bubble, and this is where I'm coming because there's sociology behind that. All of this Brussels bubble is actually Brussels. It's the center of power. It's a bristling capital of power, of empire if you want. But this is not one monolithic block. It is full of very different logics, very different people, very different representation of interest. And I'm coming to this. Whatever your background, you know that politics is about general interest, right? You do politics because you want the general interest to resemble this or that. You're green, you want the general interest to be taking into account the situation of the planet, the situation of the economy to be sustainable, the next generations, the generations that are far aside, and that are here. That's basically your representation of the general interest as a green. But that's just general interest in a political view. It could be another political view. Your general interest, you think that the economy should be primal and that companies should have the rights to do whatever they want so that the economy is booming, which means basically that you are mainstream left or right. What I'm saying is that this is only a representation of the general interest. You have many other representations of particular interest. Particular interest can be sectorial. It could be the interest of, I don't know, organic food. This is a sector. This is one particular sectorial interest. Very interesting and very important and very dear to the green thinking, but it's only one sectorial interest that might run counter other sectorial interests, where there are other people and other interests that you need to take into account. Well, let's say the enemy, for instance, the agribusiness. It's still also a particular interest that you need to take into account because there are people behind it. And it's the same for the chemical industry, and I'm talking about economic sectors here, and that's only economic sectors. It could be something else. You have the representation of regions. But for a German, Austrian mind, it makes sense because this is a very federal country. These are very federal countries, so it makes sense to have the Baden-Württemberg or the Tyrol or Niederösterreich represented in Brussels also. But it's the same for the French region, even if it's a very centralized state. You have the représentation de Bretagne, the représentation des Pays de la Loire, or Rhône-Alpes. And it's the same also in some cities. You have big cities that have also consortium of representation. And we're talking still about interest here, representation of interest. And then you have the NGOs that are also representing interest. They are usually representing a specific definition of the general interest, but they are still representing an interest. All of this, NGOs, let's call them like this, NGOs, lobbies, I usually put them together, but it's just to infuriate the Greeks, it's funny. NGOs, lobbies, but also PR companies, let's call them like this. You got the big ones, because it's a huge business. Huh? When you are the Kremlin and you want the image of Russia to be taken care of, you make sure that you have here Norton and G+ and what's the name, Boston & Masters doing their job on representing your interest and correcting your image. Azerbaijan is doing this also. I mean, a huge, important element of the representation of interest and image is also institutionalized. It also has institutional money, and that is part of the Brussels bubble. You will have the Azerbaijan, for instance, to give you one small but very, very vivid example, representatives lobbying hard the European Council and the European Parliament and the European Commission so that the free trade agreements is this, so that the interest of the current rulers in Azerbaijan are respected by whatever legislation is coming up, and especially when it comes to the European Parliament, the resolution on Azerbaijan is not too tough on human rights. Because this is very important in terms of public representations. And all of this, all of that big thing, is the Brussels bubble. There is a sociology in this. There are a lot of people, a lot of very different people coming from all over Europe with very different logic, once again, very different interests, and sometimes conflicting. So everyone telling you Brussels decided is just giving you like a tiny, tiny bit of the picture. What is very interesting is how the decision was taken. How? And sometimes, even within one government, they don't even know what the other member of the government has been doing. I'll take one French example that I love. You remember there was a small glitch in the matrix when it came to diesel emission, right? And the problem is that it was also discussed, and this is where it's interesting because this is another one. This is here. It was discussed in comitology. You know what it is? Well, of course. This is the dark side of the European law-making, the comitology. The comitology are the standing committees of the representatives of the Commission, the Parliament and the Council that are watching over the regulatory developments. This is where decisions are taken, decisions that have been already taken, voted for, but that need implementing, and sometimes you have also a legal basis for this that needs to be voted in both the Council and the Parliament. I'm sorry, I won't go too much into details because, first of all, it would take us too far, and second of all, this is not my point. My point is, in comitology, you have also big decisions that are taken, that are definitely Brussels, but where the shadow representation of the interest of the industry, for instance, through the representative of the government, is actually much more powerful than anywhere else. The biggest lobbies you will find in Brussels are not the industry, it's the governments. These are the strongest lobbies. And I'll give you I'll give you two examples. And the first one that I started with was this one. So there was talk about the threshold of dioxide emissions, right? NO2, I can't remember, anyway. There was talk about that, and the problem was that a big industry had cheated, the big industry that is very important to a big country, but not only to a big country, but to other countries. And the thing is, the French government, representative in comitology, sided with the German government on pushing up the threshold so that no longer there would be a problem with the threshold itself. And the French Minister for Environment said it was a scandal that Brussels decided that. And everybody told her, do you know, are you aware that this is your own government in comitology that asked for that? So either she was ignorant, which is possible but a problem, or she was lying, which is also possible and also a big problem. In both cases, what we were finding here is the duplicity of the actors at the European level. Brussels is not only a center of power. It's not another fantasy of that power. Brussels is also the perfect hideout for the representation of the interests that you don't want the citizens to see. Especially when you're a big industry, and especially if you're a government that is defending the interest of the big industry rather than the interest of the people. You see that the green hat is coming up, huh? But that's the thing here. Brussels is a big bubble in which there are many different streams and many different currents. The other one that I wanted to give you, the other example, when I said the governments are the biggest lobbyists, is the, you remember maybe that or not, well, it's old, but not that old. The REACH regulation. Something that has bleached many air for a lot of people in the industry. REACH, it was a regulation on chemical substances. It was passed in 2008, 7, well, you'll check. It was a regulation, it was something extremely green. It was about more than 100,000 substances that needed to be registered and controlled. But the very moment the Commission came with this proposal, 3 big countries broke ranks and say, okay, well, we don't want this to be taken by the Environment Committee here, or the Environment Constellation of the Ministers. We want this to be treated by the industry. Guess who? Berlin, Paris, London. Because in those 3 countries, the interest of the chemical industry was so high, so big, that it was very easy for those representatives to call their government and say, well, you know, it might be a problem for us, so it might be a problem for you. Politics is not one block. Politics is made of that, whether we like it or not. But this is part of the daily challenges of being a citizen. If you know the picture, and you need to know it, not just because you are in training politics or whatever, but you need to know it because you are citizens, and if you want to be a citizen, you need to be informed on increasingly complex things, but on everything. You need to make sure that you know how the thing works. Because otherwise you're just driving the car, and the moment it breaks, you can't fix it. And that's exactly what's happening today with democracy. It's breaking up, and not enough people know mechanics. Not enough people know how to open the boot and start rumbling with the engine. And this is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about the engine here. So you need to know who to address. You need to know where to find. I mean, if you're an NGO, you already are in the loop. You already are in the know. But if you're not, if you're just like a citizen in your neighborhood and you want something, do you know that there's a committee on petition in the European Parliament? Do you know that you can address the ombudsman? Do you know that there are representation of interest that you can actually pay to get your message across? You turn to your parties, but the parties are just one element of the big picture. And sometimes the parties are tied just because it's too delicate, or they don't have reach, or they don't have outreach. Talk about the Greens sometimes. I mean, all of this is very important because this is here. And so you're debunking the myth. Every time you're talking with someone who's just like Brussels is the new empire, yeah, okay, fine, cool. What are you talking about? This is the start. This is not the end of the discussion. And this is why who is Brussels is very important. This is why you need, at some point, just because, well, it's the same for the national process. You need to know how it works. I've done the test a few times. I mean, you talk about French politics with French people and you ask them, how is the law made in France? They get blank. But the drama is that Brussels is so undemocratic, you know, because it's so arcane. Yeah, but you can't even say it at your national level. You can't even say how it works at your national level. But still you have familiarity with it, so you deem it legitimate. Whereas here, it's so far away, it's so foreign, it's so different. It's so French for the non-French, it's so non-French for the French, to give you one example, that the distance that it creates makes it impossible for you to trust it. Fair enough. It's not exactly how it works. How it works is how you understand the way it works. So far, no questions. Good. Which brings me to the second point. What the hell is it all about? What is Brussels doing? The English language has something fantastic. It makes the distinctions between politics and policies. I don't know about Hungarian, but I can tell you that the other languages that I speak in, you don't have such distinction.
Yeah, yes. Politics, policies, policy.
So you have it in Hungarian.
It's me policy.
Yeah, so you have it in Hungarian. I don't speak Hungarian, so it doesn't exist in Polish, in German, in French, or in English. Sorry, or in French.
We do use the same word for both of them.
Yeah, mean, we have the
policies.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, if we want to translate the words into Hungarian, we use the same words in Hungarian. Of course, we distinguish them.
But when we are defining it, what does it mean? Politic, we use these three words.
Yeah.
Okay, but there you go. Green politics is how the party is behaving. Green policies is what the party is proposing. But that's exactly two very different things. Politics and policies is exactly that. It's the difference. And for a majority of its history, the European Union, well, it was first the European Community, was doing policies. Can you name a few? Do you know any policies of European level?
Foreign policy.
Yeah, that's probably, you're picking the most difficult one, because this is probably the only one that was not, or that was never exactly a policy as such, but always meddling into politics. But let's put it foreign policy. I would rather say enlargement policy. That was a policy, enlargement. But I was more or less expecting something like common agricultural policy. This is still 40% of the budget. So, excuse me, this is still a big thing. Common agricultural policy. It's not common agricultural politics. It's not a political thing. It's highly political, of course. But it's not something political. This is a policy. Policies where, I mean, you have also the single market policies, the consumers policy, I mean, all the policies that you can imagine, except industrial policy, because they don't know how to do that. But competition policy also, very important, embedded in the treaties in the beginning. This is the reason why the bad treaties that are defending always a pure competition are also the treaties that you can use to pressure Apple or Google to get them taxes back to where they belong. So, you know, you can read a text always both sides. Well, I'm just taking those policies. Enlargement policy is actually a very good one, because it was one of the, until 2000, the merge was in 2013 or something. Well, until the end of the last legislature, the enlargement policy was one also of the most successful and one of the most known policies of the European Union. But those policies are what? Those policies are exactly, and this is where I was leading, those policies are the embodiment of something that doesn't exist before they are called, which is called the European interest. It doesn't exist. There is no such thing as European interest. Where is the European interest of 500 million citizens? You don't know it before. There is a big cognitive problem here, because you don't know also what is the national interest of Hungary or France or Poland, but you have the representation that gives you, and you have the history of course, that gives you, well, the foreign policy of France is to balance Germany. You have the foreign policy of Poland, which is to find a way between Germany and Russia. You have, well, those are foreign policy matters, but you have also the national interest of Germany is to defend the interest of the big industry, the car industry especially. The national interest in the French economy is to make sure that there is a strong agricultural sector that the French can use to export as much as possible and create a lot of value. So those are national interests. And within the national interest you have, as we say, the local interest, the representation of the local interest, the sectorial interest, etc. It breaks down to something, but you have a certain representation of what the national interest is. When it comes to European interest, you don't know what it is. What is the European interest? Is it the French interest? Is it the German interest? Is it the Hungarian interest? Is it this sector or that region interest? Of course not. It's nothing of that. So you need to create one. And the only way to create one is to have a bureaucracy that is going to do a common policy. Because what's important in this is not what you put in the middle, it's what you put in the beginning and in the end. You have a common something policy. Because this is the common policy that creates the common interest. Because the common policy is the only way to bring together the representative, the stakeholders of, remember REACH, of the chemical industry. So you will have the companies, but also the trade unions, the workers, the people who are behind it, whose job is at stake if you regulate too harsh. But also the consumers, whose life is at stake if you don't regulate too harsh. But also the environment, which has no voice. At least no voice until the Greens have here. But that's also the point. I mean, no one speaks up for the environment, or the animals, or the planet. By default, someone has to. And it's the same. I mean, this is the interest. And this is why, for instance, in the Charter of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, you have the right, you have a little article saying that the European citizens are entitled to clean, safe environment, etc. Which you can use, but of course it's trumped most of the time by the fact that you want jobs and growth, etc., etc. But yes, it's there. To create a common interest, you need to forge it, you need to fabricate it. And you fabricate it and you make it happen by creating a common policy. And that's the work. And it's not always very well done, and it's not always set in stone, and it's far from being monolithical as well. It needs to be evolved, it needs to change, there are reforms, there are review, etc., etc. But this is the way you bring different interests together, or you try to bring different interests together. And this is why, so far, policies have been the core business of the European institutions. But all of this has changed, because increasingly, it's no longer the policies that matter, it's the politics in it. And we saw it with the diesel element. We can see it also with the organic food. There was just a regulation that was passed. Sorry, not a regulation, a directive that was passed in the European Parliament. And the German delegation, to give you one green example, the German delegation in the European Parliament, the German Green delegation, is at odds with the German Greens in Germany. So we're not even talking about a political fight between two parties or two representations or even two countries. We're talking about the fight between two representation of the interest, two vision of the interest. Because there is a European level of regulation and there's a national perspective on it. And the German Greens in Germany were a little bit more sensitive, to put it mildly, to the argument of the agro-industry, not the agro-industry, but the the supermarkets and the great distribution. Whereas the German Greens in the European Parliament, and I'm mentioning them because it was a Green rapporteur from Germany, this is why. Otherwise I'm not obsessed now. Were a little bit more in the European matter, so more regulation and less defense of Aldi and Lidl and others. And this is where you see that a European interest, even within one political family, can break down the differences, can enhance the differences between the perspective, the national perspective and the European perspective. And at some point you need to make a choice, whether you prefer to choose one or the other. Politics now is increasingly the talk of the game. It's no longer, behind the policy there are strong, and now it's visible, there are strong political arm wrestling. And that makes also a big change in the nature of the European Union. This is why it no longer is a simple, let's say, bureaucratic, technocratic thing that you pursue like this, but this is something that is a living object, that is the object of everyone. Because the lesson behind that, and this is connected to the first part, the lesson behind that is very simple. If it's politics, then it's our business. If it's just policies, this is an expert thing. This is for technocrats. Here, you have the people who know. And people who know are not necessarily bureaucrats, it's also NGOs. They have a lot of expertise. And this expertise is actually part of the lawmaking. I'm taking a small step back. Whenever the policy is in the making, it's not only the national interest that is, or the national representation that is consulted. It's every stakeholder. In this, the European construction, the European Union has been a pioneer. The UN also does that, but it's a level of complication that is sometimes impossible to resolve. But not only the consultations, maybe sometimes you see that passing. A lot of citizens don't, but even people in the Brussels bubble, they don't see it. Consultations, green books, white books, that are just the preliminary phase of a consultation that will at the end do a CP, a common policy on something. Consultations are broad range. It's not only the industry that is consulted, it's not only the trade unions, it's the NGOs, it's collective, it's representation of interest from maybe a region or within a region of a group of people within a region, or just individual citizens that are responding to it. So it's extremely inclusive, which doesn't mean that everyone is heard with the same attention, of course. But the principle is very inclusive. Always. There's a difference between the theory and the practice here. But the theory, it's extremely wide, broad, deep, inclusive. Now, within the whole thing, then, the people who know, the technocrats, the bureaucrats, they make a proposal of common policy. But when it comes to politics, it's no longer the realm of the people who know. It's the realm of people who pretend to know. It's the realm of people who have the right not to know, the citizens. Because they still have to decide at some point. So they have the right not to know. They even have the right to be wrong. I mean, you can vote in your consciousness, but it doesn't mean that you're always right when you vote. And that's the thing. It comes into politics. And the first, and this is where the crisis has been tying the knot, the first people who have brought back politics into the European institutions and the European debate are people we don't like very much. Because the first one were the populists. Now, small disclaimer. I will use the word populist, but what I mean is actually far-right populist. Okay? Left populists also did bring the debate, but they were lagging. The first ones who actually have started to rant against the European Union, the European community, were the far-right populists. Actually, they were even the far-right parties, full stop. But that starts in the 80s, basically. The streams of far-right that we have in Western Europe, and that you're starting to feel very well also on this side of Europe, because in no way there is an East-West divide in this. In no way. I know that it's common sense to pinpoint the Orban and Kaczynskis of Europe, but those people are in power, so they're much more visible, but they're not the pioneers. The pioneers are not there. The pioneers are in Western Europe. They're in Austria. They're in Switzerland, not even the European Union, okay? They're in Switzerland. They're in Sweden. They're in France. They're in Italy. Those people started it. What are the two things on which populists rant since ever? Migrations and Europe. Islam and Europe. Those are the two things that they can rally a lot of people against. And it works wonder. Take the history of the AfD in Germany. Alternative für Deutschland. AfD has a model and a history. The model of AfD is the United Kingdom Independence Party. They were founded on everything, on exactly the same thing, against the euro. and the Eurozone. UKIP was founded in 1991, and it was founded by professors of university, mostly economists, that were against the Maastricht Treaty and the common currency. AfD was founded by a bunch of economy and university professors, Bernd Lucke for instance, who were also wary of what the Eurozone governance was meaning for the safety of the euro from a German perspective. Basically, in their mind, the mark should be back, basically. And in both cases, those very nice and intelligent professors were quickly overwhelmed by the nationalist rant that took over their party and that merged two things: the rant against Europe and the rant against Islamic migrants or migrants full stop. Here it was more migrants from Eastern Europe, but it was migrants anyway. And here as Muslims. Because AfD before that was separate from another movement that was called Pegida, which were nationalist marches against Islam. And I remember telling to a couple of German members of the of the Green Group in the European Parliament and tell them, the moment AfD and Pegida merge, you'll understand that you have the same problem as the rest of Europe. They didn't believe me, but it happened. And today AfD is a purely neo-Nazi party. Well, this is disclaimer, you don't follow this. I don't want to be to see my head knocked or something. Anyway, the two things that you can rally people against are Islam and Europe, because they both encompass the foreign thing. Europe is foreign bureaucrats that are trying to take away your sovereignty. Both true and completely stupid, but that's it. It's easy for people to remember. Islam is here to take away your lifestyle, your women, your tranquility, and your Christian values. You name it in the sense that you want. Easy. Whether it's true or not, it doesn't matter. It has a forceful impregnation of your imagination. And populists, and I thank them for that, have the one who have brought back politics into the European Union debate. We should be thankful for that, because they represent, of course, it's not very easy to deal with, especially when you have to deal with sheer stupidity and racism, but still, we should be thankful that they brought back in the center of the debate the fact that you cannot leave a political object such as the European Union without meddling in. You cannot leave it to the technocrats. And the call that is behind this is that, yes, and you cannot leave it to the populists neither. You need to get into the reflection on the European Union as a citizen, because you cannot leave the European Union be hostage, the political object that it is, to be a hostage of a fight between the technocrats and the populists. Both sides are not the enemy, of course, but both sides are the same coin. A coin that you want to toss and to claim back the political object that it is and transform the European politics into national politics, to make sure that there is no such thing anymore as domestic politics. There is only a domestic version of European politics, if you prefer. This is taking a lot of work, because this is a moment when you need to run on many different plans altogether. Planes, sorry, not plans, but planes. You need to run on the one that you inherited, the legacy of national politics, on which still all major decisions are made. Like European elections are still fought on national level. We don't have the transnational lists. And I'll give you a small thing here. Decisions are still taken by national governments gathered in the European Council. And if you keep on going at this, I mean, most of the debate is also of a national perspective on European issues. So you don't do this away like this with a magical wand. It doesn't work like this. and it would be wrong also. You do not build the European legitimacy against the national legitimacy, because if you do that, then you make sure that the nationalists have won. You need to pursue both levels altogether, the same way that you pursue both levels of local politics and national politics. But today, we need to make sure that this duet, opera duet, which is not a duo, this duet of populists and technocrats is no longer the only narrative that we have at European level. And that means that we need to have a very daily, trivial political approach of the European Union, like we have on any other issue, because this is the framework in which the politics are now being held. Which brings me, I'm stopping here, and I'm bringing you to the third part. No question? Maybe it's because you speak English in a way that you don't understand and you all switched off, or no? Good. Hopefully not. Let me introduce you to the 4 ghosts of European politics. Since they're ghosts and bad guys, they're all guys. No gender balance here. And I'm sure you know them. They're the Fantastic Four. You know the Fantastic Four, right? Why are they the Fantastic Four? They're the Fantastic Four because they're invisible, they're rock hard, they're extremely plastic and can change form anytime, and they're incendiary. Every time you mention them, Fantastic Four. Meet Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Charles de Gaulle, Jesus Christ, and Uncle Scrooge. Those ghosts are everywhere in the European debate. Everywhere. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is the everlasting ghost of democracy. There is only one democracy, the national democracy, and everything else is bullshit. That's basically the Rousseau approach. Because there is only one thing, there is the national sovereignty. And anything that is not national is illegitimate. Anything that is not sanctioned by the history of national institutions doesn't exist. There is no such thing as European democracy. Or there is. There you go. Here is democracy, legitimacy. What makes a decision legitimate? What makes us obey something? Because this is what democracy is about. It's the legitimation of your obedience. Why do you obey? Because there is the police, and if you don't, you get sting? Or because you feel that you're part of the decision? Or because you feel that it's better this way, and anyway, I won't succeed in overthrowing it? Why do you do that? Why do you obey a law? And fear of the police is one way, but only one thing. You also obey the law because you believe that it's better this way. Or you obey the law because it's a good law. It happens. Some laws are good. But that's the thing. Where is the legitimacy of the whole thing? You will find the ghost of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the ghost of what is a democracy, everywhere in the debate, even though you're not talking about that. Even though you're talking about something else. Of course, in the institutional debate, you will have that. It's the essence of the debate. But behind that, you will have a, is it legitimate to have workers of a big country over workers of a small country? Is it legitimate to have the consumers of Central Europe eat shit, whereas the other ones do not? Where's the legitimacy here? You're talking about the legitimacy of a community. You're talking about the fact that it's a whole. And whether this whole is legitimate and democratic is the talk of the town. You will find Rousseau or his friends, Montesquieu and Habermas and a few others, everywhere, or Kant, everywhere. The second is Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle is the talk about the borders of Europe. No, sorry, not the borders, but borders are connected to that, but to the purpose of Europe. There is one big thing. Is Europe, is the purpose of the construction of a united, politically integrated continent, is the purpose to build a superpower or just a super single market? That is a question that has been always not taboo, but swept under the rug. Like, yes, yes, of course, we want an Europe puissant. Yes, yes, we want a single market. Because it's both, of course. But the problem is that in some national perspectives, it's either or. And I'm using Charles de Gaulle here because you have two major visions that have been confronting and that Brexit is bringing a resolution to, which is the French and the British one. And this is why Charles de Gaulle is interesting, because he was a French who fought from Britain. Europe puissance means basically that for each and every member state, Europe is the one way to get bigger on the international scene. This is the way for Belgium, or mind you Hungary, to get heard from bigger players that would not even know to place you on the map. Washington, for instance. Because since '89, I think Budapest is no longer on Washington's maps. This is something that the Poles have discovered. And they're much bigger than Hungary. They discovered that in the years 2005-2006, that whatever the administration, they were no longer exactly a great ally. It was a big, difficult moment for them. Of course, things evolve, huh? But at that time, trust me, it was a crisis of faith. That's one way. It's game in the globalization. Size matters for what it takes. Size matters because in the next, well, you know the rap, huh? In the next 20 years, not one European country, not even the biggest one like Germany, will pretend to be part of the G5, let alone the G7, or the G20, for what it takes. Because it will be the schoolyard of the bigger powers. And the bigger powers today are mostly in Asia, and it's very difficult to imagine that the United States could resist the thrust of China. Actually, it's already the biggest economy in the world. So that's behind it. Is it the purpose to become a power and a global player in the on the global stage? Which everything that is connected to that is foreign policy, defense policy, capacity of regulation at international standards, at global standards in the WTO, etc., etc. That's all of this. Or is it just a bloody single market, like the Brits fought for so long, because this is exactly what they were told. In 1975, when they get into the European community and they vote for it, because there was a referendum at that time, they were told that it was just for economic purposes, that it was just a single market stuff. The ever closer union stuff in the treaties, never mind, it doesn't mean anything. Of course it does. But everybody acted as if it didn't. Everybody was living on the ambivalence that the purpose of the European Union is a single market. No, the single market is a means towards something political. Whether that thing political is a Europe power is another question that you can discuss. For instance, in the green perspective, you could say that it's not exactly to be a big player on the globalization to defend the European interests that you want Europe to be a power, a political power, but because this is the only way to make the planet great again. This is the only way to have the leverage at global stage to pursue the elements that you want you green to see achieved. That's one way. But it's still a matter of power. You do not do that as a single market. You do not pursue any kind of climate house emission targets as a single market. A single market is just here to make sure that goods and capitals are flowing fine. The single market doesn't care about people, it cares about workers. True. and this is also a big issue for the Brits, but it doesn't care that much about people. And it cares for the workers in as much as the workers become a commodity. If the capital can flow, then the people will flow. That's the single market thinking. That is the way the British discovered what the European Union was about. And I'm talking about them because they are just the spot of the light today with their Brexit. But this is a debate that is not just a national or between national debate. This is something that you find within the countries. And I'm pretty sure that Europe Puissance, Europe Single Market, this is something that if you ask the question in Germany, or in Poland, or in Italy, or maybe not in Italy, they were always quite federalist, but in Hungary also, you will find very senses, some more closer to the British view and some closer to what I call the French, but it's not actually just the French. It's just that as a founding member, this is where the blueprint was put. But this is very important because it conditions also, the purpose of the European Union, conditions a lot of the talks also. And a lot of the talks that I'm coming to. Okay. Why is Jesus here? Well, you're in a country that really speaks for itself. The question that is behind that is Europe identity. What is the EU? Is it just a white, rich Christian club? It looks like it. In the eyes of EPP, or even farther, it is. It needs to be white and Christian first. Never mind if we've got like 15 to 20 million Muslims in Europe, never mind if Islam, as the Ottoman Empire, has been part of European history since a lot of time. Not because it depends when, since the 7th century, 8th century, etc., etc. But since it was part of the European history, and mind you, European identity, since ever, Europe has been the foyer of global colonization, which means it brought the world to itself. It expanded in the rest of the world and brought the rest of the world to itself. The wealth, of course, but also the people. It was black soldiers who died for France in 1914 in the trenches. It was Indian soldiers that fought for Britain. Europe is connected to the rest of the world. So the question behind that is, what is Europe's identity? Because if you talk about values, you're doomed. Values are always two-pronged, bifaced, always. Europe, to give you one example, was Christian with everything that it brings, the message of love and Christian, etc. And also the Inquisition at the same time. Europe was the Enlightenment of Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Kant, and the slavery at the same time. Europe was growth and national emancipation and colonization at the same time of the 19th century. You cannot resolve yourself and reduce yourself to values. There will always be a European value that is contradicted by European behavior. Always. What you need to know, what you need to do, and what you need to find out whenever you are in the midst of the debate is how you relate to the project itself. What is the European identity? Is it a closed identity, or is it something that is in connection with the rest of the world, in connection with its history? One of the greatest difficulty, and I've seen that, I didn't mention that, but I learned Europe from Warsaw for a long time, so Central Europe is also my second home. The thing is, I noticed that for a long time, it took a long time in the Polish debate to understand that being part of Europe meant that you no longer had the monopoly on your own history. You had to let other people tell yourself something about your own country. But even for the French it was difficult. Huh? The first big important book on the France de Vichy, so the 1940s, not exactly the moment of French glory, was written by an American historian. And it was published in 1975, so pretty good time after everything was settled. And that was the moment when there was a big debate in France. Same in Germany, the historical Streit in the 80s was also sparkled by a book by Winkler, of course, but also because there were foreign historians taking part to it. This is part of it. This is something that, for instance, is extremely difficult to understand for Turkey. I'm not saying Turkey is part or not part of the European Union. It's not my purpose. It's not my point. What I'm saying is that the moment Turkey becomes one, a lot of things that are common rules in Turkish politics no longer can apply. And one of them is the way the history is understood and taught in Turkey as a big, centralized thing that from Kemal to Erdogan, basically. It's no longer possible. You need to have people to come and to tell you, well, there was a genocide in 1915. Are you sure? Well, that's the thing. You no longer have the monopoly on your own history. And it's the same for every member state, for every community. And it's gradual, it's taking time. But that's the thing, behind that there is the question of identity. And behind the question of identity, you even have the question of borders. Because borders are here. They're a matter of both identity. Where do you stop? Do you stop in Russia? Is Russia part of the European civilization or not? Ask the Russians. You won't get one answer, you got two. But it's also a matter of purpose. Enlargement. Do you enlarge until Canada is part of Europe? After all, Canadian values are very close to the European values. They are European values. So why not Canada in this case, if it's value-based? Right? I'm not even saying this for the sake of the provocation. It was argued at some point by some scholars, but it was argued. So those are not fancy debates. Those are debates that you can find every time that you're talking about something that is completely unrelated and disconnected. Identity and purpose make the question of borders.